I would like to start this seminar first by welcoming everyone for joining us today. My name is Catherine Trabouillon. I'm from the Department of Political and Social Change. And I would like to begin by acknowledging and celebrating the first Australians from whose lands I speak, and pay my respect to the elders past, present, and emerging. So today we welcome Sebastian Strangio as our speaker, and he will give a seminar entitled Southeast Asia Faces a Rising China. Obviously, anyone among you who has ever followed Cambodian politics will already know him as the author of Hun Sen's Cambodia. Last year, Sebastian has published a second book with Yale University Press, and this one is entitled In the Dragon's Shadow, Southeast Asia in the Chinese Century. So our seminar today will proceed in two parts. The first 45 minutes are dedicated to Sebastian's presentation, and that will be followed by a 45-minute roughly Q&A and discussion. Some of you may have noticed that I'm recording the session, and I would like to reassure everyone that only Sebastian's presentation will be recorded and put online later on. I will pause the recording when we move on to the discussion part. So Sebastian, I'm incredibly pleased to get to host your talk today, and I think that I speak for everyone when I say that I'm very keen on hearing more about your research. So with that, I will pass on to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Katrine, and thank you for inviting me to come talk today. It's a privilege to to be hosted by the ANU. My only disappointment, of course, is that we can't be doing this in person. But hopefully before long, I'll get a chance to visit the campus in Canberra and speak to more of you in person. So often when I discuss, my new book and the wider issue of Southeast Asia-China relations, I find it useful to discuss my own entry into this subject and the things that first got me interested in the ways that Chinese power was reshaping Southeast Asia and the world as a whole. I first came in contact with this issue during the 8 years I spent as a journalist working and living in Cambodia, and this was a formative period, in the expansion of Chinese influence and China's economic presence in Cambodia. Between 2008 and 2016, when I lived in the country, China became the country's #1 trade partner, its #1 source of foreign direct investment, and the top source of the tourists that came in large numbers to visit the temples of Angkor in the west of the country. This was a period that also coincided with a growing Chinese self-confidence and assertiveness on the international stage. Being in Cambodia, and particularly the fast-growing capital of Phnom Penh, offered an interesting and illuminating angle on China's resurgence. This was evident sort of in the physical realm. Everywhere we went around the country, we saw evidence of China's expanding investment presence. Concrete bridges arched across the Mekong River. Chinese-funded highways were opening up remote parts of the country. And increasing numbers of Chinese expatriates, business people, students, and tourists were visiting the country. And their businesses and enterprises were becoming an ever more apparent sight on the streets of Phnom Penh and other Cambodian towns and cities. But I found Cambodia particularly interesting, not simply for the abundant physical evidence of Chinese investment, but also for the more, the political and ideological overtones of what was happening in the country. And so I'll now offer a brief digression to sort of, where Cambodia had come from over the past few decades. Many of you will know that at the end of the Cold War, just 2 months before the final collapse of the Soviet Union, 4 Cambodian factions came together to sign the Paris Peace Agreements, a treaty that had been many years in the making and that was aimed at ending the country's endemic civil war and remodeling Cambodia as a liberal democracy, and putting the country on the path towards peace and prosperity. The Paris Agreements paved the way for a large-scale UN peacekeeping mission, one of the largest that the world had ever seen up to that point, and infused the country with the liberal optimism that followed the end of the Cold War. And this was to deeply and profoundly inform international, particularly Western perceptions of Cambodia in the years to come. This the country encapsulated, or the UN mission encapsulated, this sense that the world was moving, converging on some variant of liberal democracy and free markets. And I think that the country has been, perceptions of the country have been conditioned by this to a certain extent ever since. But this was a vision that was challenged by the incumbent government in Cambodia, led then as now by Hun Sen, who viewed things from a very different perspective. Now, I'm not going to get too stuck into the details of exactly what informed Hun Sen's worldview and a lot of the tangled backstory. But, suffice to say that Hun Sen viewed the coming of democracy and the international community's commitment to same as something that empowered his enemies, rivals with which he'd been at war throughout the 1980s, and threatened his party's hold on power. So as such, in the years to come, he set about undermining and subverting the democratic institutions that the UN mission introduced to Cambodia. And he became increasingly fed up with sort of, the constant Western lectures and pressure about introducing democratic and human rights reforms, and sought to shrug off his country's status as a special liberal democratizing project, which it had become in 1991. And over time, he turned increasingly to a rising Asian power that took a much more hands-off approach to engagement, and that was China. China had been a relatively minor player in Cambodia at the time of that the UN mission arrived in the country in 1992. But by the time that I left the country in 2016, China's economy had grown by 20 times. Its exports had increased by 26 times. And its ambitions and self-confidence under, paramount leader Xi Jinping were, apparent for all the world to see. And by this time, Chinese support could feasibly substitute for the Western money and development aid upon which the country had previously relied. And so I came to see that, through Cambodia's modern history, it was possible to read the wider fate of the liberal international order, which was supposedly born out of or attained its full expression in the wake of the Soviet collapse at the end of the Cold War. And so a nation that had been one of the great hopes of the post-Cold War era turned out to signal its fragility and contingency. Like a tiny satellite of international politics, Cambodia's trajectory reflected a wider global shift in the balance of power and prestige. And so after witnessing up close this slow motion transition within Cambodia, I began to be interested to see how this was playing out in other parts of Southeast Asia. And so as I traveled around the region, reporting on various issues, I always kept an eye on, what people thought of China's expanding investment presence. I talked to a lot of locals. I tried to get a sense of, how this power was being viewed and what role that a long history of interactions with China was playing in conditioning or informing the region's response to China's reemergence in the present. So in conceptualizing Southeast Asia's relationship with China, I think it's handy to think both in terms of structure and agency. Now, on the question of structure, which is probably what I'll focus mostly on in this presentation, we can leave the question of agency more to the Q&A session. The most salient factor is the brute reality of geographic proximity. Now, this is something that's always ensured a strong, Chinese presence and influence in the regions that lie to its south. Long before we could speak of Southeast Asia and China in the modern senses of the terms, the two regions were bound together by countless bonds of trade, economic interaction, and immigration. And the regions of the fates in the modern era have been, particularly closely entwined. In 1971, Malaysia's former then Prime Minister Tun Abdul Razak observed that since Southeast Asian countries dwell so closely to China, they're very often the first to feel the impact of her and consequences of her policies. And if these consequences were relatively fleeting and episodic in the pre-colonial era, this changed significantly after the founding of the PRC in 1949, when Southeast Asia became Chairman Mao's laboratory of revolution, a place in which China sought global leadership through the sponsorship of communist insurgency across the region. And it is true to an even greater extent today in a new age of Chinese wealth and power, in which infrastructure development and economic integration have bound the two regions more closely together, arguably, than at any point in history. The reality of proximity naturally affects how both regions view the other. For China's present government, proximity naturally makes Southeast Asia a region of strategic importance. Seen from Beijing, Asia is a claustrophobic place. It is hemmed in on every side by powerful rivals, including nuclear-armed powers like Russia and India, and also a string of US treaty allies that lie off its eastern coast, running from Japan to South Korea to the Philippines, and also including Taiwan, which has a very close relationship with the US as well. But hemmed in on every side by these various potential rivals, Southeast Asia is the one region where there is no incumbent great power. It is a relatively fragmented region. 11 nations make up what is generally recognized as Southeast Asia, and in comparison, China enjoys, in most cases, a massive asymmetry of power with each of them. And so hence, this is a place that Chinese strategists have always perceived that they can break what they view as a chain of encirclement, sort of restricting China's, power and ambition. And the region's importance naturally grew along with China's economy in the 1980s and 90s, when it became ever more reliant on exports of manufactured products to the world market and imports of oil and other goods to keep its economic engine humming along. Chinese strategists became particularly fixated on what Hu Jintao would later refer to as the Malacca Dilemma, the country's paralyzing reliance on imports through the Straits of Malacca, particularly oil and gas. And so during this period, Chinese strategists grappled with the question of how to secure the sea lanes of communication that thread the maritime regions of Southeast Asia, and to prevent their interdiction by any hostile outside power. One thing that emerged from these years of economic expansion was a determination to build up a blue water navy able to protect these vital sea lanes. Another thing was the desire to forge overland connections through mainland Southeast Asia, from China's landlocked southwest provinces to the Indian Ocean, which would provide an alternative route for energy imports and exports to the world market. And this, I think, is the fundamental strategic rationale of China's maximalist claims over the South China Sea. I think China views this important seaway much in the same way that the United States viewed the Caribbean from the end of the 19th century as its own domain, the control of which is crucial to its long-term security. I think that any Chinese government that one could imagine would have an interest in establishing effective control over this region. Now, the CCP has, additional, nationalist investments that make it very hard for it to back down or compromise on any of these claims. But I think underlying all of the talk of historical claims and, is really a fairly basic strategic consideration. Now, for Southeast Asia, on the other hand, proximity to China has always been a mixed blessing and is a source of increasing anguish and ambivalence. The lure of economic opportunity, of being plugged into China's giant economy and benefiting therefrom, coexists with a fear and a trepidation about what a powerful China will mean for the region's future. As Tun Abdul Razak's comment from the early 1970s makes clear, these fears have been long-standing. But in recent years, the region's proximity to China has in many important ways been increasing, heightening the region's consternation about its northern neighbor. So in mainland Southeast Asia, Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, new infrastructure networks have broken down what was once a thick and nearly impermeable barrier of mountains and forests that historically kept the power of the various Chinese empires and dynasties at arm's length. New networks of highways, rail lines, and special economic zones, now grouped, many of them under the aegis of China's Belt and Road Initiative, have slowly precipitated a reorientation of the Mekong region's economic centers of gravity away from the port cities of the South, which once connected these nations to global imperial trade networks, towards the north, towards the economic power that lies to the north. These new transport networks have also opened the Mekong region to a transformative sweep of Chinese investment and immigration. A similar impact can be seen with China's damming of the upper reaches of the Mekong River, which nourishes the 5 downstream nations and upon which tens of millions of people rely. What we've seen in recent months is increasing evidence that the decisions of Chinese dam engineers now have, massive impacts downstream, and hence give China, the Chinese government, increasing strategic leverage over the downstream nations. We see a similar collapsing of distance at sea, where China has broken with the inward continental orientation of the old Chinese dynasties and ventured out into the oceans. While China's people roamed through the waters of the South China Sea, trading from Borneo to Siam, the Chinese state itself, in general, disdained the oceans for most of history as a world of chaos and piracy, as an unruly realm that couldn't be tamed through the usual land-bound methods of imperial administration. And so as a result, the focus of the various imperial states tended to be inward, continental, toward the north, the steppes of the north and west, from which historically the main threats to the power of these dynasties came. And so aside from a fleeting moment at the beginning of the Ming Dynasty, when China did send out large armadas on missions of exploration and conquest through the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean, the various Chinese empires were never maritime powers. But since the 1980s, we've seen the gradual buildup of a powerful Chinese navy designed to secure its control of these vital sea lanes. And on the mainland, mammoth infrastructure projects, in this case, the dredging and construction of island fortresses in the South China Sea, has collapsed the distance, once again, that once separated China from the peoples and states of the Malay archipelago. In some parts of the Spratly Islands, a mere handful of kilometers separates Chinese-held features from those held by the Philippines. And from, some of the Philippine features, the Chinese installations on these reclaimed islands can be seen on the horizon. And so for all the nations of Southeast Asia, China and its people and the power of its state are closer than ever before. This growing proximity and the increased Chinese assertiveness that has accompanied it and to some extent driven it forward has thus dialed up the latent Southeast Asian concerns about China and reawakened memories of China's past actions in the region. Most notably, this includes the PRC's support for communist insurgencies throughout the Cold War. It also includes the vexed and closely related question of China's relationship with the region's ethnic Chinese communities, a fear which in many ways predates the establishment of the PRC, rooted in the rise of Chinese nationalism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These worries have been underscored by other negative impacts of China's increasing economic presence in the region. One has been the negative externalities of large-scale infrastructure projects, which, as in China, have swept people off their land and caused serious environmental problems. There's also the question of debt. The fear of, the specter of debt-trap diplomacy, looms over a lot of China's activities in the region. And while China's approach to debt is not nearly as purposeful as the phrase debt-trap diplomacy might imply, this remains a concern for a lot of countries in the region and is beginning to shape public opinion in important ways. These various negative perceptions have generally been further compounded by the Chinese government's posture and attitude toward the region. As a large power surrounded by small states, China has a responsibility to assure the region of its benign intentions. But from the South China Sea to the upper Mekong River, much Chinese behavior has achieved much the opposite. In very general terms, China's rise has been accompanied by an assumption that as the largest nation and economy in the region, Southeast Asian states should defer to Chinese wishes. And Beijing has not hesitated to employ its economic power for strategic and political ends. Exhibiting a blindness that is in many ways characteristic of all great powers, the Chinese government has difficulty grasping why Southeast Asian nations might have reasons to oppose Chinese initiatives, fear Chinese power, and they frequently underestimate the potency of nationalistic pride in many parts of the region. While other large powers, including the United States, also exhibit a certain blindness and self-centeredness in their relationship with Southeast Asia. In China's case, this is clearly influenced by the government's nature, as a one-party authoritarian state, which allows very little space for autonomous political organization. This has made the current Chinese regime very awkward at engaging with more open societies and engaging with any groups that lie beyond the remit of the state. So nobody does state pageantry better than the Chinese. But when it comes to dealing with ordinary citizens and civil society groups, Chinese diplomats are often very wooden in their interactions, or refuse to engage with them at all. One could also mount a case that there is some older historical residue that comes into play as well. A residue of the imperial hauteur that was once expressed by the emperors of what was then saw itself as the Central Kingdom, when China viewed itself as not simply the most civilized nation in the world, but the very definition of civilization itself. And so whatever the causes, this has led to a Chinese inability not only to respond effectively to some of the negative reactions prompted by its rise, but also to the idea to grasp why China's actions could arouse such reactions to begin with. As I write in the book, the general Chinese message to the Southeast Asian nations is one of either flourishing within a Chinese orbit or languishing outside of it. In this category, we need also to include the recent attempts made by Xi Jinping to broaden China's outreach to the ethnic Chinese populations of Southeast Asia. Recent years have seen Chinese officials, including Xi, making increasing references to overseas Chinese as part of a, quote, great Chinese family, and undertaking new initiatives that seek to convert ethnic affiliations and business ties into political support for Chinese state initiatives. This, I think, remains one of the most dangerous examples of Chinese official blindness in Southeast Asia, and one of the most potentially combustible issues that China faces in the region. In some countries where ethnic Chinese have always maintained a precarious foothold in the national community, Chinese increased outreach runs the risk, and in some cases is already reawakening old fears of dual loyalties. Yet for all of the concerns that I've mentioned, all of the concerns that have been prompted by China's rise and increasing proximity to Southeast Asia, the governments of the region still have good reasons to maintain stable and workable relations with the Chinese government. Again, this is a question of proximity. Historically minded Southeast Asians will no doubt remember that instability within China, or the collapse of the empire into civil war and dynastic infighting, has very often translated into destabilizing flows of people to the south. At the end of the Ming Dynasty, refugees from the Ming washed up on the coasts of southern Vietnam and fled through the hills of Yunnan into Burma, prompting a Chinese invasion shortly thereafter. More recently, of course, Chinese nationalist armies fled Mao Zedong's troops once again into Burma, where they proceeded to destabilize the politics of the region for a generation. Southeast Asian governments have similarly few yearnings to return to the era of Mao, in which China was inward-looking, prickly, and actively sought to stoke revolution throughout the region. Indeed, China has grown now into a vital economic partner for virtually every nation in the region. Chinese schemes like the Belt and Road Initiative also have definite attractions, despite some of the obvious downsides. And most nations have chosen to take part in Chinese initiatives, reckoning that the benefits of participation outweigh the risks. And I think we see this also with the way that nations have responded to China's vaccine diplomacy in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. There's been a sense, I think, that COVID-19, by plunging the region into what is potentially an era-defining economic recession, has underlined the reality of China's proximity to the region. Even while countries are concerned about the initial bungling that led the coronavirus to escape the areas in which it arose in China, China looms as an inevitable part of the region's economic recovery. And I think this is a message that the Chinese Chinese leaders are constantly trying to reinforce in their diplomacy with Southeast Asia. In addition to this, the shared, the economic entwinement of the two regions, there are also other important areas of shared interest that unite the governments of China and Southeast Asia. Chief among these, I think, is the common experience and legacy of Western imperialism, which has profoundly shaped the two regions' attitudes toward the international system as it is currently constituted. In their very different encounters with imperial power, peoples in China and Southeast Asia were forced to confront a similar dilemma, which was the failure of traditional social structures and traditional elites to meet the challenge posed by the Western empires. In each case, old systems and customs were held up to lacerating self-criticism for their failure to meet the challenge posed by the Western powers and later by Japan. And out of this intensely traumatic experience, the modern nation states of the region were born. Now, this common experience has inculcated a number of common tendencies. The first of these is a fierce nationalism. The second, a deep commitment to the norm of national sovereignty, which seeks to safeguard, the national prerogatives of these, newly imagined nations. China's promotion of an international order based on a reassertion of the sovereignty principle over international principles of human rights represents an important area of overlapping interest with many Southeast Asian governments. And of course, ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, regards the principle of sovereignty and the corollary principle of mutual non-interference with a similar zeal to the leadership in Beijing. And so this shared characteristic has produced a general dynamic in regional diplomacy. In cases where Western nations have pressured or criticized Southeast Asian governments over democratic backsliding or human rights abuses, they have generally turned to China for the diplomatic backing and quote unquote no strings financial support that China can offer. And this support has been greatly appreciated by the governments of the region, even as China's own actions, its own burgeoning imperial potential, frequently send the pendulum hurtling back in the other direction. And of course, this is a dynamic which, I observed at close hand in Cambodia, where perhaps the most concerted democracy-building efforts, that any nation in Southeast Asia has been subjected to, have resulted in a situation where Cambodia now is the nation in the region which is closest to China, which is the closest thing that China has to an ally in the region today. And I think anyone wondering why Cambodia, of all the nations of the region, has taken such a turn, has to account for this, this sort of anti-colonial reflex, very self-interested one in the case of Prime Minister Hun Sen and his cronies, but a deeply felt sense of grievance nonetheless. And so the reality of proximity in geographic, historic, economic terms makes China something that the nations of Southeast Asia cannot feasibly ignore or wish away, as much as they might wish to. And one further effect of this has made the nations of the region resistant to signing up to any US-led alliance or coalition of states aimed, explicitly or otherwise, at containing China's power. The research of this book coincided with a rapid souring in American relations with China, which accelerated after President Trump took office at the start of 2017. And this broad American consensus, one of the few consensuses that it seems to exist in Washington nowadays, has persisted to a significant degree under President Biden, sketches the Chinese threat in unequivocal terms. It depicts China as a predatory power that bullies its neighbors, seeks to export its authoritarian political model, and uses debt to ensnare small developing nations. The Trump administration in particular was fond of framing the challenge posed by China in categorical and starkly ideological terms, as a global struggle, or as the locus of a global struggle between authoritarianism and freedom. And this image has typically been set aside an idealized vision of American primacy and the US-led liberal international order that China is allegedly working to supplant. And all this has made Southeast Asia once again the subject of a tense superpower competition. Yet Washington's depiction of US-China competition as an ideological struggle has failed to gain much purchase in Southeast Asia. First of all, there are memories of exactly what the forging of that liberal international order in Southeast Asia involved. Let's not forget that the ordering of the region was a fairly unsavory business. It involved the destructive American intervention in Indochina, which included the carpet bombing of Cambodia, Laos, and northern Vietnam. This is certainly something that Cambodia's prime minister has not forgotten. It also involved American support for a parade of autocrats, from Marcos in the Philippines to Suharto in Indonesia. And in the latter case, de facto support, if not active support, for Suharto's massacre of up to 1 million suspected Indonesian communists in the mid-1960s. And so while Southeast Asian governments generally appreciate and desire American support, especially as a counterweight to China, they tend not to idealize the American role in the world. Secondly, for Southeast Asian governments, I think the ideological character of the People's Republic of China is a relevant but not determinative factor of their engagement with it. In general, I think the region's governments feel that they can live with a communist China in the same way that they live very comfortably with a communist Vietnam. Now, this isn't necessarily the case with the Southeast Asian publics, especially, probably the most recent example can be seen in Myanmar. But I think it is important to emphasize that, that in general, Southeast Asian governments see the challenge posed by China as one of power rather than principle. I think there's also a sense in which the region, understands that it would probably face similar challenges from any Chinese regime, regardless of its ideological hue. To summarize then, today in Southeast Asia, the lure and opportunity of China and the fear of its expanding power exist in almost dialectical relationship, feeding back and forth into one another and producing a deep and abiding ambivalence about China's resurgence, which as Beijing's tensions with the United States escalate, is putting additional strains on Southeast Asia's ability, both as a region and as individual states, to maintain its strategic autonomy. And here we come to the question of agency. A more powerful, ambitious, and belligerent China has posed each Southeast Asian with more or less the same challenge: how best to navigate and benefit from its rise without compromising its sovereignty or succumbing to onerous Chinese demands. Within the structure imposed by proximity and economic entanglement with China, there is room for varying degrees of agency in how the various nations of Southeast Asia engage with China's new superpower. This is something that the nations of the region have exercised with varying degrees of competence and sophistication. Some have chosen to harness Chinese support in order to pursue economic development, while others have sought to wield it as a shield against Western criticism and pressure. Some have proven adept at incorporating China into a balanced diet of foreign relations, one that also includes good ties with the United States, Japan, the European Union, Russia, India, and Australia, to name just a few other powers, while others have allowed their enthusiasm for China's easy money and no-strings approach to governance to get the better of them. With relations between China and the United States, in a state of increasing rivalry and competition, this challenge has become more acute and the balancing act trickier to maintain. Southeast Asia's perennial desire is to avoid making choices in its superpower alignments. But this desire to evade, making decisions is coming again under increasing strain. Yet Southeast Asia, has always been a crossroad of superpower interests. And in some ways, no region is better equipped in terms of its history and strategic culture to bend with the changing regional winds and preserve its freedom of maneuver in a new age of superpower competition.